It was the third day since Jesus had left the Jordan region and returned to Galilee. News had reached his mother, Mary, that a wedding feast would be held in Canaan, a small town in the hills north of Nazareth. The groom's family was known to Mary, and she had been invited to attend. The invitation extended also to her son, and to those who had begun following him. In Galilee, weddings were not small affairs. They lasted several days, filled with eating, drinking, music, and the gathering of relatives and neighbors. Wine was a central part of the celebration, not only for enjoyment, but as a symbol of joy and blessing. To run out of wine during such a feast would be a great embarrassment to the bridegroom and his family, a public shame in a culture where hospitality was a matter of honor. Mary set out from Nazareth toward Canaan, traveling the few miles through the rolling hills and cultivated fields. Jesus went with her, along with several of his disciples, Simon Peter, Andrew, Philip, Nathanael who was from Canaan, and others. The road was dry under their sandals, the air warm but stirred by a light breeze. When they arrived in Canaan, the house where the feast would be held was already full of movement and sound. Relatives from nearby villages had come. Servants moved quickly from room to room, arranging the tables, carrying jars of water for the ritual washings, and setting out bread, fruit, and roasted meat. Musicians tuned their instruments in the courtyard. Mary greeted the bridegroom's family with warmth, and Jesus entered quietly behind her. The disciples stayed near him. Their presence at the wedding was not by accident. Mary had not told them why she wanted them there, but she knew though Jesus had not yet performed any public sign that his time was drawing near. She watched him with the same attentive heart she had carried since his birth. Large stone jars stood nearby, used for purification rites according to the Jewish custom. Each jar was capable of holding many gallons of water. No one gave them much thought at the start of the feast, for their purpose was simple and ordinary. Guests continued to arrive. The groom's friends welcomed them. The women of the household brought out platters of figs, olives, and cheese. The first cups of wine were poured. Laughter and conversation filled the air. The celebration had begun. But among the busyness, Mary noticed something that others did not: a quiet conversation between the steward of the feast and one of the servants. Their faces were tense. Though the feast had only begun, the supply of wine was already lower than it should have been. Mary did not speak of it yet, but she kept the matter in mind. For now, the guests rejoiced together, unaware of the problem that would soon arise, a problem that would open the way for the first of Jesus' signs. The courtyard was shaded with woven cloths stretched overhead, allowing the guests to sit in comfort. Low tables had been set with simple earthenware cups, baskets of bread, bowls of dates and figs, and plates of roasted lamb. The scent of olive oil and spices hung in the air. When Jesus and his disciples entered with Mary, the master of the feast, the man responsible for overseeing every detail, greeted them. He welcomed Mary with respect, and Jesus with the courtesy due to an honored guest. Nathanael received a warmer welcome still, for this was his hometown. The bride and groom were not yet seated among the guests. In keeping with custom, they were inside, surrounded by family, preparing for their formal entrance. The sound of flutes and hand drums filled the air, joined by the voices of guests calling greetings across the courtyard. The disciples stayed close to Jesus, speaking quietly among themselves. They had not yet seen him perform any work of power, yet there was an expectancy about the way they followed him, as if each moment might reveal something new. Servants moved between the guests, carrying jugs of wine to fill the cups. At first, the wine flowed freely, and the steward kept careful watch to ensure that none of the vessels ran dry. But already, by the middle of the first day's feast, he was beginning to notice that the supply was not what it should be. He had counted the jars earlier. Now, the level in each was dropping faster than expected. Mary moved among the guests with quiet ease, speaking a kind word here, sharing a smile there. She noticed the steward's glance toward the storage area and the faint crease of worry in his brow. She also noticed a whispered exchange between him and one of the younger servants, who shook his head slightly. The celebration continued without pause. Bread was broken and passed around, children laughed and chased one another, and songs rose in joyful chorus. The host family was intent on showing honor to their guests, and nothing in their manner suggested that anything was wrong. Yet Mary kept her attention on the steward. She could see he was counting and recounting the remaining jugs in his mind. If the wine ran out before the feast was finished, the shame would not fade quickly. The groom's reputation would suffer, and his family's standing in the community could be damaged for years. The first day of the feast was drawing toward its height. The bride and groom entered at last, crowned with garlands, and the guests rose to greet them with applause and song. The air was thick with joy, yet underneath it Mary sensed the tension building. It would not be long before the shortage became known. The feast was in full motion now. The courtyard seemed alive with sound, the beat of hand drums, the bright notes of flutes, the rhythmic clapping of hands as guests sang familiar wedding songs. The air carried the scent of roasted lamb, mingled with cinnamon and sweet wine. Laughter rose from one corner, while in another, elders spoke in low tones about the marriage and the hope for many children. Jesus sat among his disciples, listening more than speaking. Simon Peter leaned forward as if ready to ask a question at any moment. Nathanael, sitting beside him, seemed quietly proud that such a gathering was taking place in his hometown. The bride and groom made their way around the tables, offering greetings. They received blessings from their elders, embraces from family, and joyful shouts from friends. The bride's white robe was edged with blue thread, and her veil, woven with fine linen, caught the sunlight. The groom walked beside her, his head held high, though the weight of hosting such a feast rested heavily on him. Servants moved swiftly between the tables, carrying heavy jugs of wine and trays of bread. The steward of the feast oversaw them all, his eyes moving from jar to jar, from guest to guest. He measured the level of wine in his mind, calculating how much was left and how many hours of the feast still lay ahead. By the custom of the time, the best wine was served first. Later, when the guests had already enjoyed much, the lesser wine would be brought out. But this plan depended on having enough wine to last the full length of the celebration. Already the steward was finding himself in difficulty. Mary had noticed him earlier, and now she saw the concern deepening in his expression. He gave short instructions to the servants, telling them to pour smaller portions, to refill cups less quickly. But the guests were many, and the demand was constant. Around the tables, the conversations flowed freely. Some spoke of the coming planting season, others exchanged news from nearby towns. A group of young men sang loudly at one table, raising their cups in cheer. The musicians, encouraged by the mood, played faster, and dancers formed a circle in the open space at the center. But in the midst of the joy, a problem was pressing forward quietly. The jars that had been full in the morning were now nearly empty. The steward sent one of his men to check the storeroom, but the report was no better. The wine supply was indeed running out. Mary's eyes followed the servant as he returned to whisper in the steward's ear. The steward's shoulders tensed. He looked toward the groom but quickly turned away, unwilling to bring him the news yet. Jesus continued to sit quietly, his face calm, his attention moving from the feast to the people. His disciples seemed unaware of the shortage, still enjoying the music and food. But Mary's thoughts had begun to focus. She knew that this was no ordinary situation. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower, casting a warm light across the courtyard. Guests were asking for refills, and the servants were moving slower now, trying to stretch what remained. The steward was running out of options, and soon the lack would become obvious to all. Mary decided she could wait no longer. Mary moved through the crowd quietly, her steps sure. She found Jesus where he sat with his disciples, and she leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was low so that only he could hear. "They have no wine," she said. She did not explain further. She did not describe the steward's worry, the nearly empty jars, or the risk of public shame. She simply stated the need, confident he understood. Jesus looked at her. His expression was calm, yet there was a depth in his gaze that held more than words. "Woman," he replied, "what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His words were not harsh, but measured a reminder that the timing of his mission was not set by human urgency. Yet Mary did not turn away in disappointment. She did not argue or plead. Instead, she looked toward the servants nearby. "Do whatever he tells you," she said to them. The servants glanced at one another, uncertain. They had been preparing to carry out the steward's next instructions, but now they were being told to listen to this guest instead. Still, something in Mary's tone, a steady certainty, made them pause. Nearby stood 6 large stone jars, used for the Jewish rites of purification. They were massive, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. Their surfaces were cool and rough, the color of pale limestone. Earlier, guests had drawn water from them to wash before eating. Now they stood partly empty. Jesus rose from his place and spoke to the servants. "Fill the jars with water." The servants hesitated for only a moment, then set to work. They fetched water from the well, carrying it in heavy pitchers. Trip after trip, they poured until each jar was filled to the brim. The water glistened in the light, still and clear. When the last jar was full, Jesus gave his next instruction. "Now draw some out," he said, "and take it to the master of the feast." The servants looked into the jars. The water they had poured moments before was now wine-deep in color, rich in scent. No one could say when the change had happened, but it was complete. They dipped a cup into the jar and carried it carefully to the steward. The steward did not know where the wine had come from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. He tasted it and his eyes widened. It was not the lesser wine that hosts would serve later in the feast. This was better than what had been served at the beginning. He called the bridegroom aside. "Every man serves the good wine first," he said, "and when the guests have drunk freely, then the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." The bridegroom smiled, not understanding the source of the steward's praise, but glad to hear it. Mary, standing apart, watched silently. She knew what had happened. This was the first sign her son had given, quiet and without public announcement, yet filled with meaning. The crisis had passed. The feast could continue. The servants could not take their eyes off the jars. Just moments before, they had been bending under the weight of the water pitchers, their arms aching from the repeated trips to the well. They had poured until the cool water touched the very rim of each vessel. Now, without any word of blessing spoken aloud, without any motion except Jesus' calm instruction, the contents were no longer water. The change had happened in complete silence. No flash of light, no sound, no stirring of the liquid, yet the water had become wine. One of the servants leaned closer, the faint aroma meeting him before he even touched the rim. It was rich, deep, and unlike any wine he had known. He dipped a ladle into the jar, and the color confirmed it, a dark, full red that caught the light like garnet. There was no room for doubt. They had drawn water. They now held wine. Jesus did not move to explain. He simply told them to take some to the master of the feast. 2 servants obeyed, holding the cup carefully, as though it were a precious gift. They carried it through the crowd, weaving between the guests until they reached the steward. The steward lifted the cup and drank. His face changed almost at once, surprise giving way to genuine pleasure. He took another sip, letting it linger on his tongue, as if trying to find fault and finding none. It was the finest wine he had tasted that day. He called the bridegroom over and spoke in the hearing of several nearby guests. "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the guests have drunk freely, then the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." The bridegroom, unaware of the shortage or its sudden solution, laughed in relief at the praise, nodding with gratitude. To him, it was simply a mark of generosity and good planning. But the servants knew. They kept silent, yet their eyes searched for Jesus among the guests. They found him back at his place, sitting quietly, his face calm, as if nothing unusual had taken place. The disciples, too, had noticed the exchange. Simon Peter leaned toward Andrew, speaking in a low voice. Nathanael's expression was fixed, his mind working over what he had seen and heard. Philip looked from the jars to Jesus, the beginnings of understanding in his eyes. This was no simple act of hospitality. It was a sign not only of power, but of purpose. Mary remained still, her gaze resting on her son. She had seen him live in patience and humility for years, waiting for the right moment. Now, here at a village wedding, he had begun to reveal his glory not before the crowds in the synagogue, not in the courts of Jerusalem, but in a quiet act known fully only to a few. The feast continued with renewed joy. The wine flowed freely once more, and the music and laughter filled the courtyard. Yet for those who knew what had happened, the air seemed charged with something greater, a sense that the ordinary world had been touched by the power of God. The music swelled again as if nothing unusual had taken place. Guests lifted their cups, the fine wine filling the air with its sweet, full scent. Conversation and laughter rose freely, dancers spun in the open space, their robes swaying in rhythm. But for a small circle of people, the feast had changed in meaning. The servants went about their duties with a quiet sense of wonder. They poured from jars that moments ago had held water, watching the deep red flow steadily into every cup. They exchanged glances, each knowing they had witnessed something beyond explanation. The disciples were silent for a time, each lost in thought. Simon Peter's eyes were fixed on Jesus, as if studying him for the first time. Andrew's face was calm but intent, the way one looks when realizing a promise is beginning to unfold. Nathanael in his own hometown seemed almost struck still. This was the one who had spoken of him under the fig tree, and now, before his eyes, had turned water into wine. Mary stayed close enough to see him, though she did not seek his attention. She understood that this was only the beginning. The words, "My hour has not yet come," still echoed in her mind, a reminder that greater things lay ahead, and that this sign was a first step toward them. The steward, still unaware of the miracle's source, continued his duties, proud to serve what he believed was the groom's finest reserve. The groom, relieved of worry, enjoyed the honor given to him for keeping such wine until late in the feast. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Lamps were lit, their flames flickering in the evening breeze. The feast would continue into the night, but for those who had seen, the memory of this moment would not fade. John, one of the disciples, would later record the event simply. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. The miracle was not loud, not public, and not done for spectacle. It was done to reveal to those ready to see the presence of the Messiah in the midst of ordinary life. And the lesson was clear. Where he is present, lack turns into abundance, and what is common becomes extraordinary. When you think about the wedding at Cana, it's easy to see it only as a miracle of wine. But it's also a picture of God's ability to transform the ordinary into something greater than we imagined. What is one ordinary area in your life where you need Him to bring transformation? Share your thoughts. Your reflection might encourage someone else.